They built their wealth on promises no church could sanctify, and when the veil slipped, even the loyal fled, their screams swallowed by the woods. The story of the Sinclairs begins in the year 1720, when Edward Sinclair, a Scotsman of modest means, first set foot upon the banks of the James River. He was not the sort of man one might expect to carve out a dynasty. He carried little more than a weathered trunk of belongings, a family Bible worn at the edges, and a sharp determination that seemed to radiate from his pale eyes. What he lacked in coin, he compensated for with an uncanny instinct for land. The parcel he purchased was unremarkable by ordinary measure, 200 acres of scrub forest and untamed soil, far from the rich plots claimed by established planters. Yet Edward spoke of it as if it were destined, as if the earth itself had been waiting for his arrival. Neighbors were quick to dismiss him. They scoffed at the rocky fields and the low marshlands that fringed his property, shaking their heads at the folly of the foreigner. Yet in the years that followed, the Sinclair land flourished in ways that defied both reason and the seasons. Where other fields withered under drought, his tobacco leaves grew broad and fragrant, their edges curling with a richness unseen elsewhere. When floods swallowed the lowlands and ruined the crops of nearby farmers, Edward's barns remained miraculously full. He prospered, quietly at first, then with a confidence that could not be ignored. Those who lived nearby whispered of strange practices. They said that Edward worked his fields by moonlight, walking the rows and murmuring in a tongue no one recognized. Some claimed to have seen candles flickering deep in the woods where no chapel stood, the shadows of figures swaying as though in solemn procession. When questioned, Edward only smiled, his thin lips pressed into a curve that concealed more than it revealed. He attributed his success to hard work and providence, but the regularity of his prosperity strained credulity. As the years passed, misfortune seemed to fall not upon Edward but upon those who opposed him. A neighbor who quarreled over boundary lines fell ill within a fortnight, his farm reduced to weeds within a year. Another, who accused Edward of cheating in a tobacco deal, drowned in the James River, his boat capsized on a calm evening. In every case, Edward extended condolences, offering aid to the widows and buying up their lands at modest prices. By the time his first decade in Virginia had ended, the Sinclair estate had tripled in size, and Edward stood as a man of substance in the county. Yet those who worked closest to him, indentured servants, hired hands, and the enslaved who came later, spoke in low voices of a different truth. They told of a great oak at the far edge of the property, older than memory itself, where Edward was known to linger alone for hours. They spoke of offerings left at its roots, and of the way Edward's eyes gleamed when he returned from those vigils. Some said the prosperity of the Sinclair line was not bought with labor or luck, but with something far older, something darker. And though no one dared confront him openly, there were many who believed that the Sinclairs had struck a bargain with powers beyond human reckoning, a covenant worth more than gold but paid for in a currency far dearer. Would you like me to continue, Chapter 2, in the same style, building the eerie escalation with the pact in the hollows? By the mid-1720s, Edward Sinclair's fortune had grown so steadily and with such unnatural rhythm that neighbors began to murmur in tones they dared not raise above a whisper. Hard work could not explain the perfection of his crops, nor could skill alone account for his uncanny timing in trades and land purchases. Men who had lived their whole lives along the James River found themselves undone by failed harvests, while Edward, a foreigner barely a decade in Virginia, seemed shielded from every ill wind. Those who labored for him told hushed stories at night, their words carried like sparks from one household to another, until the name Sinclair was spoken with a mixture of envy and unease. It was said that Edward did not sleep as other men did. He was seen wandering the fields by torchlight when the moon was high, his shadow bending strangely upon the rows of tobacco. Some swore that he carried a silver chalice and poured wine or darker fluids into the soil, murmuring in a voice too low to comprehend. When asked, he claimed he was praying for rain, but those who had watched from the hedgerows returned with a certainty that his words were no prayer to God. The unease deepened when a traveler disappeared near his land. The man had been a peddler from the Blue Ridge, carrying bolts of cloth and trinkets in a cart bound eastward. He was last seen passing the Sinclair property at dusk, offering a wave to a farmer working his fields. By morning, both man and cart were gone. His horse was found grazing by the riverbank, reins snapped, eyes wide with fear. A search was mounted, but no trace of the traveler could be found. Dogs led their masters into the dense thickets at the edge of Sinclair's estate, but refused to go further, whimpering and pulling at their leads until they were dragged away. At the center of those woods stood an oak tree so vast that 4 men linking arms could barely span its trunk. Its limbs stretched outward like ancient guardians, roots clawing deep into the earth. The tree had stood long before Edward arrived, a landmark of forgotten days. Locals avoided it, for it was said the air beneath its canopy was colder, and birds fell silent when they passed overhead. Yet Edward was often seen near its base, kneeling as though in reverence. Servants claimed they had watched him press his hand against its bark until blood ran down his arm, seeping into the grooves of the tree. From these whispers arose the belief that Edward had made a covenant with something that dwelled in those hollows, a presence older than the colony itself. What he gained was prosperity, health, and power beyond measure. What he gave in return was never spoken of plainly, but mothers told their children not to stray near the Sinclair woods, and men walking home after dark crossed themselves if they saw a lantern flicker among the trees. For it was known, though no one dared prove it, that the Sinclairs' wealth was guarded not by providence, but by something that lingered in the shadows, waiting for its due. Would you like me to move straight into Chapter 3 with Elias Sinclair's inheritance, or do you want me to keep deepening Edward's timeline before we shift to the next generation? By the summer of 1817, the name Sinclair carried weight across Virginia, and with the death of his father, Elias Sinclair stood at the head of a fortune that had swelled beyond the wildest imaginings of his immigrant grandfather. The original 200 acres had multiplied tenfold, stretching from the banks of the James into the rolling interior. Where Edward had built a modest homestead of timber, Elias raised a manor of brick and stone, a great house with tall white columns that gleamed in the morning sun. The locals watched its construction with awe, and some with dread. For, though the family's prosperity was undeniable, its source remained shrouded in shadow. Elias was a man both admired and feared. His face was stern, his words measured, and his temper tightly leashed, but quick to ignite. He had traveled to Europe as a young man, walking the old streets of London, Paris, and Vienna, and he returned with an appetite for refinement. The mansion he built was adorned with imported glass, carved marble mantels, and silk draperies brought across the Atlantic. In the great hall, a chandelier of Venetian crystal blazed with 100 candles, casting its light over portraits of ancestors whose eyes seemed to follow every guest. Visitors were received with impeccable courtesy, yet there was a chill beneath the surface, a sense that one had stepped into a house where unseen rules governed every interaction. Among the servants, it was said that Elias kept one room in the manor forever locked. No maid was permitted to clean it, no hand was allowed to touch its door. The chamber lay on the second floor, at the end of a narrow corridor lined with bookshelves. Its key never left Elias's possession, and even his closest kin were denied entry. Some claimed to hear sounds from within, when the house was otherwise silent: the scrape of a chair across the floor, the echo of footsteps pacing back and forth, or, on rare nights, a low humming like a voice carried through stone. One servant swore that when she passed by, she felt the handle burn hot beneath her fingertips, though no fire was near. Elias was ambitious beyond the bounds of land and wealth. He believed the Sinclairs were destined for greatness, chosen by forces older than nations. He spoke rarely of his grandfather Edward, but when he did, there was a gleam in his eye, as though he carried some private inheritance more potent than fields or coin. Rumor held that he spent hours in the locked chamber alone, emerging pale and drawn. Yet afterward the Sinclair fortunes seemed always to rise. Crops sold for higher prices, debts dissolved, and rival planters found themselves beset by sudden calamity. The family prospered, and Elias wore the outward trappings of success, the fine horses in his stables, the library filled with rare volumes, the cellar stocked with French wines. But beneath the grandeur of Sinclair Manor lay the sense of a covenant still alive, a pact whispered of in generations past, that had not been broken, but strengthened. Whatever dwelt in the hollows beyond the oak seemed now to dwell within the walls of the house itself, and Elias Sinclair, proud heir of a dark legacy, guarded its secrets with a zeal no intruder dared challenge. Would you like me to continue with Chapter 4, The Locked Chamber's First Disturbancer? Deepen Elias's reign with more unsettling details before the chamber becomes central. When Elias Sinclair took Lady Catherine Blackwood as his wife, the people of Virginia whispered as though a storm had rolled in from the sea. She was a widow of uncertain origins, arriving in Richmond with little family to vouch for her and fewer friends to speak her history. Yet Elias welcomed her with open arms, and by midsummer she was mistress of Sinclair Manor. Her arrival was marked not by kinfolk or bridal parties, but by a procession of wagons bearing trunks bound in iron, and a single dowry chest said to be filled with silver heirlooms. The chest was so heavy that 4 men strained to carry it through the front doors, and when it was set upon the floor, the house seemed to exhale, as though adjusting to a new weight upon its soul. Lady Catherine herself was striking in a manner that unsettled rather than comforted. Her skin was pale as parchment, her eyes a gray so light they seemed like storms on the horizon, and her manner was gracious but guarded. She wore a veil of silver-threaded lace whenever she entered the church or rode through town, a delicate thing said to have been woven by cloistered nuns in France. Women whispered that the veil concealed more than a woman's face. Beneath its shimmering threads, her features blurred, as if light bent in strange ways around her. Some claimed they glimpsed a faint shadow lingering too long upon her cheek, or that her lips moved in silent words when no sound emerged. Though the townsfolk regarded her with suspicion, Elias seemed enthralled. He rebuilt the east wing of the manor in her honor, filling it with European luxuries she requested. Tapestries stitched with ancient heraldry, tall mirrors with gilt frames, and candelabra wrought in twisting, unfamiliar shapes. At night, servants reported the glow of candles burning late behind her chamber doors, though no one dared to interrupt. She moved through the halls with a calm authority, her veil trailing like a ghostly banner, and soon the house itself seemed to take on her presence, colder, more watchful. The silver chest she brought remained locked, its key kept upon a chain around her neck. Once, when a curious maid leaned too close to dust it, she recoiled with a cry, claiming her hand had been stung as if by nettles. Afterward, no one approached it willingly. It was said that when Catherine knelt before the chest and rested her veiled head upon it, a faint ringing filled the room, like the toll of distant bells. Her union with Elias bound the Sinclair name to something deeper, something that reached across oceans and centuries. The Sinclairs had already been whispered of as a family marked by a covenant with shadow, but with Lady Catherine's arrival, it was as though the pact had been sealed anew, wrapped now in silver threads that gleamed in both candlelight and moonlight, and promised that whatever legacy Elias intended to build would not be his alone to command. Do you want me to press directly into Chapter 5, The Locked Chamber Stirs, next, or should I steep further into Lady Catherine's strange influence before the disturbances begin? The night Lady Catherine bore her first child was a night the servants of Sinclair Manor never forgot. The house trembled with storm winds that rattled the shutters and sent rain in sheets against the windows, as though heaven itself sought to drown out the cries from the birthing chamber. Elias paced the halls like a man possessed, his boots striking the floor with restless fury, until at last the wail of an infant cut through the storm. A son had been born to the Sinclairs, and with him, so the whispers claimed, the covenant that had bound the family since Edward's day was due to be renewed. Yet when the midwife presented the child, Elias did not smile. He looked upon the boy with eyes darkened by some private weight, and before dawn broke he had vanished from the manor without a word. For 3 days his whereabouts remained a mystery. The horses in the stable stood restless, their eyes rolling white when the woods beyond the fields stirred at midnight. The servants claimed they heard howls rising from the hollows, sounds not wholly animal and not wholly human, as though something older had awakened in the wilderness. Lady Catherine, pale and veiled even in her confinement, said nothing, though her gaze lingered on the storm clouds that refused to part. When Elias returned, he staggered through the great doors with his coat torn and his skin smeared in blood, though none could say if it was his own. His eyes burned with a strange brightness, and though his face was drawn, his lips carried the faintest curve of triumph. Without explanation, he demanded to see his son. In the nursery, beneath the watchful portraits of grim ancestors, he lifted the swaddled infant and pressed his forehead to the child's. Then, with a voice that carried through the rafters, he declared, "This boy shall live under protection bought with more than gold." The words hung heavy in the air, and no one dared ask their meaning. But the staff whispered of strange marks glimpsed upon Elias's arms, faint as brands burned into his skin, shaped like curling branches or twisted runes. Some claimed that the silver veil Catherine wore grew brighter in those days, shimmering even in darkness, as if reflecting light unseen. The child slept soundly when other infants would wail, and when he gazed at his father, it was with an intensity that unsettled those who watched. From that day, the fortune of the Sinclairs seemed to swell once more. Debts vanished, harvests thrived, and rivals met with ruin. Yet beneath the prosperity lay the shadow of Elias's vanished days 3 nights when he had gone into the hollows, and returned bloodied, smiling, and bound by something neither gold nor land could ever equal. Would you like me to carry the thread of the child's uncanny growth into Chapter 6, or keep focus on Elias's dealings with the covenant first? The servants of Sinclair Manor spoke in whispers, their voices lowered even when no master lingered near. They had lived long enough on the land to know that shadows did not move idly around the old chapel ruins that sat in the far corner of the estate. The building had been abandoned for decades, its roof sagging and its altar long since crumbled to dust, yet some nights the broken windows glowed faintly, as if candles burned inside. None claimed to have lit them, and yet the flames seemed steady, untouched by wind or rain. The enslaved men who worked the fields told of hearing voices when they passed too near after sundown voices chanting words in no Christian tongue. The syllables rolled like stones in a river, deep and harsh, carrying a weight that pressed into the chest and lingered in the ear long after the sound had faded. Some said they caught sight of figures kneeling among the weeds, their heads bowed, though when the torches were raised, nothing was there. One woman swore she had seen Lady Catherine herself walking toward the chapel beneath her silver veil, the night after Elias returned from his 3-day absence. She moved as though floating, her gown trailing through the grass without stirring dew, and yet when the woman blinked, the mistress was gone, leaving only the faint scent of smoke and something copper-sweet upon the wind. Another servant claimed Elias stood there at midnight, his hands raised high, though no light touched his face. What they prayed to, none dared name aloud. Fear spread through the quarters, for strange things followed these gatherings. Milk soured overnight, dogs howled until dawn, and once a newborn calf was found lifeless in the barn, its body untouched by predator or blade. The older workers muttered that the Sinclairs' good fortune was paid in secret coin, a bargain struck not in gold but in blood. The chapel, they said, was no longer a house of God but a door, and doors could open both ways. The whispers never reached Elias or Catherine directly, for to speak of such matters before them was unthinkable. Yet when the servants knelt in their own prayers, their words grew more urgent, asking for protection against powers they did not understand, but felt pressing closer each season. At times the wind itself seemed to carry laughter across the fields, and the ruins of the chapel loomed as a warning none could ignore. Whatever covenant bound the Sinclairs, it was being fed in secret, and those who toiled on the land could feel its hunger. Do you want me to carry the next chapter into the child's early years and his unsettling aura, or deepen the mystery of the ruined chapel first? The land of the Sinclairs bore fruit as if blessed by an unseen hand, though those who lived nearest whispered it was no blessing at all. Year after year, while drought shriveled the fields of their neighbors and floods turned farmlands into stagnant marshes, the tobacco of Sinclair Manor rose tall and lush. Leaves stretched broad and green as if drinking from some hidden well of life, their stalks thick with vitality even when skies offered no rain. Buyers from Richmond and beyond paid dearly for Sinclair tobacco, praising its flavor as richer, smoother, finer than any other. The family coffers swelled, and Elias strode through the rows of thriving plants like a king surveying his realm. But those who worked the soil carried unease in their bones. They knew each harvest demanded more than toil and sweat. Every season, someone vanished. A man who bent his back in the fields all summer would not return to the quarters come autumn. A woman who carried water and sang lullabies at night would be gone by morning, her bed left cold, her name unspoken. The overseers recorded nothing, offered no explanations. Their absence was swallowed in silence, as though to speak of the missing was to invite the same fate. Those who remained marked the pattern. It was never the same household, never the same kin twice in a row, yet always just enough to keep fear alive. Some swore they saw shadows leading their fellows away toward the ruined chapel, where the faint glow of candles never died. Others believed Elias himself selected them, walking through the rows of workers with his stern gaze, as if measuring more than strength. The unlucky ones, they said, met his eyes too long and were gone before the next moon waned. The crops grew taller with each disappearance. Bales of tobacco stacked higher, wagons rolled heavier, and wealth seemed endless, yet the air around Sinclair land thickened with dread. At night, mothers clutched their children, whispering prayers to any god who would listen. Fathers told their sons to keep their heads down and never draw notice. And always, beneath the prosperity, a truth lay buried like bones beneath the fields. The harvest was never free. The land demanded its due, and the Sinclairs paid with lives, the missing folded into silence, their absence woven into every leaf sold and every coin struck. Would you like me to take the next chapter deeper into Elias's locked chamber and its secrets, or show how the community outside the estate begins to sense that Sinclair wealth is unnatural? The locked chamber of Sinclair Manor was a place spoken of only in hushed tones. Door servants passed with lowered eyes, pretending it did not exist. Elias had forbidden entry, the key never leaving his person, the handle polished by the weight of his touch, yet never turned by another hand. But temptation, as it often does, found its way into the heart of one young servant, a boy tasked with carrying linens through the upper hall. He lingered one evening as the master descended to the cellars, the key left dangling in the lock for but a breath of time. The boy's hand trembled as he pressed against the wood, curiosity overcoming fear. The door creaked, and within he glimpsed a world no soul was meant to see. The air in the chamber was heavy, carrying the metallic tang of blood so thick it burned the nostrils. Iron symbols covered the walls, carved deep as if the very plaster bled. They twisted into patterns no priest could recognize, shapes that seemed to writhe in the candlelight, though the room stood still. At the center loomed a long wooden table, its surface dark with scars of knives, grooves etched into it from repeated carvings, the wood polished not by age but by ritual use. And on a stand beside it sat a basin of silver, its rim finely engraved with serpents and thorns. The boy's eyes widened as he saw what it held, blood, fresh and dark, filling the bowl to the halfway mark, though no hand had poured it, no body lay near. The surface shimmered as though stirred by some unseen breath. Terror seized him, yet fascination rooted his feet. For a moment he thought he heard voices soft, coaxing, like a lullaby sung through water. But the sound ended when he stumbled back, slamming the door shut. His heart pounded, his lips sealed. He told no one, not even those he trusted most, for fear the words themselves might betray him. Yet the household seemed to know, for within days his gaze was marked. Elias lingered longer when passing the boy in the halls, his eyes unreadable, his silence heavy. Lady Catherine's veil seemed to turn toward him even when she did not move. A week later, the boy was gone. His pallet lay empty, his few belongings untouched. No overseer asked, no ledger marked his name. Those in the quarters said nothing, but every heart knew. The chamber had claimed him, as surely as it claimed all who trespassed its secrets. The locked door once more stood silent, but within, the basin never emptied, its silver rim glinting faintly with the promise that it never would. Do you want me to carry the next chapter into the local clergy sensing unease around the manor, or deepen the family's growing entanglement with the covenant? The children of Elias and Lady Catherine moved through Sinclair Manor like pale phantoms, shadows of privilege that unsettled even those accustomed to the family's ways. Thomas, the eldest, carried himself with the bearing of a boy far older than his years, his voice measured, his words too deliberate, as though each syllable was chosen with care not natural to youth. Eliza, slender and watchful, had eyes that seemed to pierce through any who met them, the gray of storm clouds over the James. Samuel, the youngest, bore the same pallor as his siblings, his skin so fair it seemed untouched by the Virginian sun, though he played at times in the fields. All three shared that same curious stillness, that lack of childish clamor, as if they had been born already disciplined, already marked. Servants whispered that the children had never been brought to the church, never baptized beneath holy water, nor cradled in the prayers of the parish. Their births were spoken of as private affairs, kept behind the doors of Sinclair Manor, with no midwife from the village allowed entry, no minister called to bless their first breath. Some said this secrecy was Lady Catherine's will, that she, being foreign, mistrusted the hand of the local clergy. Others insisted it was Elias who forbade it, declaring his offspring already protected. That phrase alone spread like smoke through the fields and quarters, repeated in dread as though it explained far more than it revealed. Rumors darkened as the years passed. The children, though elegant in dress and polished in manner, were rarely seen at play with others. They avoided the company of neighbor families, their visits to town scarce and fleeting. Horses startled beneath their touch, dogs growled low when they drew near, and even the birds in the orchard seemed to fall silent when they passed. More than once, a field hand swore he heard the children speaking in tones that were not their own, voices too low, too layered, carrying a cadence that did not belong to any tongue of Virginia. And yet, their beauty was undeniable. Strangers remarked upon it at gatherings, how the children of Sinclair glowed like porcelain in candlelight, their hair shining with unnatural luster, their gaze both alluring and cold. To many, they seemed touched by grace, yet to those who worked beneath the family's gaze, that grace felt more akin to a mark, a sign that the covenant made long ago still coursed through the blood of each new heir. No christening font had ever washed it away. No prayer had broken it. They were children born into a legacy stronger than gold, raised in the shadow of a promise their parents had renewed, their very breath a continuation of that dark inheritance. Would you like the next chapter to shift into how the neighboring families react to the Sinclair children's presence, or focus inward on the secret rites that shape their upbringing? Reverend Josiah Alcott had long been a steady voice in the parish near the James, a man whose sermons were plain and firm, carrying more weight of conviction than flourish. He had watched the rise of the Sinclairs with mounting suspicion, uneasy at the prosperity that clung to their house even as neighbors withered in hardship. In the pulpit, his words began to take on a sharper edge, no longer subtle in their aim. There are those among us, he warned one Sunday, who thrive not by God's blessing, but by a darker covenant. Their gold is bought in blood, their plenty drawn from unholy soil. His eyes had drifted toward the pews where Elias Sinclair sometimes sat with Lady Catherine and their pale children, though on that day the family was absent. Within the week, Alcott was gone. His neighbors recalled last seeing him walking the road near Sinclair land, carrying his well-worn Bible beneath one arm. He had spoken then of paying a visit, of confronting Elias himself, though none knew what words he intended to deliver. By morning, his house was found empty, the door unlatched, a lantern still burning by his desk. His horse returned to the stable alone, its flanks lathered with sweat as if it had been driven hard in the night. A search party was raised, combing the fields and woods along the river. They found little, only scattered signs that his path had taken him toward the old boundary where Sinclair land began. It was there, in the shadow of a sycamore tree, that his Bible was discovered. The leather cover lay open to the book of Isaiah, though the page was warped and stiff. The letters were obscured beneath stains that had sunk into the fibers, dark and ruddy, the color no ink could mimic. Men whispered but dared not name what it was, save to cross themselves and turn their faces away. The Sinclairs made no mention of the Reverend. Elias, when pressed by neighbors, merely smiled thinly and said that men of zeal sometimes strayed farther than prudence allowed. Lady Catherine, veiled and serene, declared that prayers would be said for him, though no tears welled in her eyes. In the quarters, among the enslaved, the whispers were different, that Alcott had wandered too near the ruined chapel where the candles burned without hands, that voices not his own had lured him into the dark. They said his cries had been heard faintly that night, swallowed by the trees, and that something in the hollows had claimed him as it had others before. In the parish church, his absence was keenly felt. The pulpit stood empty for weeks, and the congregation, when gathering, cast uneasy glances at the door, as though fearing the Sinclairs themselves might enter with a new sermon written in blood. From that time forward, no minister in the county dared speak their name aloud in condemnation, for the lesson of Reverend Alcott's disappearance lingered, heavier than scripture, darker than ink. In the autumn of 1820, when the tobacco fields shone like sheets of gold under the waning sun, Elias Sinclair announced a gathering to surpass any feast Virginia had ever seen. Invitations were sent by courier, bearing wax seals pressed with the family crest, summoning planters, merchants, and distant kin to Sinclair Manor. The mansion itself had been freshly adorned for the occasion. Silver candelabra polished until they glared like mirrors, imported carpets laid down across the oak floors, and a banquet table stretched near the length of the great hall, laden with dishes that seemed to defy both season and soil. Guests marveled at the abundance as they entered. Platters of roasted meats steamed beside pyramids of fruit that could not have been plucked from Virginia orchards in late October. Figs, peaches, and grapes glistened in the candlelight, though frost had already touched the fields. Pies exuded spices so heady that some swore the very air grew sweet as they passed. Yet it was the wine that drew the most remark, dark and thick, poured from silver vessels into waiting goblets. Those who drank claimed it carried warmth unlike any vintage, as though it had been quickened by fire within the mouth. More than one guest joked uneasily that it seemed like blood drawn from living flesh. Elias presided at the head of the table, his pale face animated by an uncharacteristic mirth. Lady Catherine, veiled in her silver lace, raised no toast but watched the company with eyes as sharp as knives behind the gauze. Their children sat silently beside them, eating little but smiling faintly as the courses passed. Conversation grew loud with merriment, though beneath it ran an unease, for the sweetness of the food clung to the tongue too long, and the meat seemed almost to melt away rather than yield to the teeth. As the night waned, several guests grew pale and unsteady, rising to leave before the final course. By dawn, reports spread across the county that many who had dined at Sinclair Manor were taken with violent illness, stomachs twisting, fevers rising, some bedridden for days. Strangely, none among the family nor their household servants appeared touched. Elias himself was seen on horseback at first light, surveying his fields with vigor, while others lay groaning in their chambers. Whispers soon crept through the countryside. Some said the feast had been poisoned, though to what purpose no one dared guess. Others swore that the Sinclairs had fed upon their guests in some fashion unseen, drawing vitality even as they smiled across the laden table. The term, the Golden Banquet, began to pass from lip to lip, not in praise but in dread, for all agreed that such plenty could not be born of nature. The mansion stood resplendent still, yet those who had attended carried with them a taste they could not forget, unnaturally sweet, warm as blood, a memory that would not leave the mouth. It was during the spring planting of 1821 that the first grave was found. A field hand, clearing brush near the edge of the Sinclair property where the woods pressed close against the fields, struck something hard beneath the soil. At first he thought it was a stone, but as he scraped back the earth with his spade, pale bone glimmered in the light. Further digging revealed a shallow pit, no coffin, only a scatter of skeletal remains half consumed by roots and clay. The skull was intact, but marked with carvings that made no Christian sense lines intersecting in circles, symbols etched so deeply they had scarred the bone itself. The man recoiled, fear stiffening his body. He whispered to another nearby, and soon a small cluster of workers gathered, staring in silence at the grim discovery. One of them, an older woman, crossed herself and muttered that such marks belonged not to God's earth, but to something darker. Word spread quickly through the quarters, the story twisting into something larger with every telling. By dusk, Elias Sinclair had arrived with 2 overseers. The field hands were ordered back to their work, while Elias himself stood over the disturbed earth. His expression, pale and unreadable, flickered only once when he stooped to lift the skull in his gloved hand. Some swore he traced the symbols with a kind of recognition, as though confirming something he had long expected. Without a word, he handed it to one of the overseers, who bundled the remains in rough cloth. That night, the pit was filled in, the soil tamped flat, and by morning the ground bore no sign of what had been unearthed. Yet whispers carried further than soil could bury. Workers spoke of more unmarked mounds scattered through the estate, hidden where plows never touched. Some claimed to have seen fresh-dug earth after moonless nights, and once, a boy swore he saw Elias himself kneeling at such a mound, lantern beside him, lips moving in prayer not meant for heaven. Others muttered that the missing servants, those who vanished every season without explanation, had not been sold off or run away as the overseers claimed, but had been put into the ground with those same carved skulls. The fear grew until even neighboring farmers took notice. A man from downriver confided to a friend that he had seen figures moving by torchlight near the Sinclair woods, their shapes too many for a simple burial. The name, the unmarked graves, began to pass quietly among the people, always in hushed tones, always with eyes darting over shoulders. To speak too loudly was to invite misfortune. Yet all knew what lay beneath the fertile fields that never failed, and more than one hand shook with dread when touching Sinclair soil, as though the earth itself pulsed faintly with the secrets it concealed. It was said that when the moon was high and the manor lay silent, Lady Catherine could be seen gliding across the Sinclair grounds like a phantom loosed from its grave. She wore a white gown that trailed against the grass, and always she carried with her the silver veil that had arrived with her dowry chest years before. The veil shimmered faintly in the dark, catching what little light the stars offered, as though it were spun not of silk but of frost and shadow. Servants who peered through cracks in the shutters swore that she would stop at certain places on the land, the old oak, the ruins of the chapel, the edge of the fields, and there she would stand, whispering softly to the night air as though in quiet conversation. No other voice answered, but her replies came steadily, pauses filled with listening, nods tilted toward unseen companions. Some said she spoke to the dead, perhaps those buried in the shallow earth. Others claimed she addressed figures only she could see, silhouettes that shimmered faintly around her when the veil was lifted. And there were darker tales still, whispers that the veil itself was no mere garment but a relic with power, woven by cloistered hands who knew what it meant to trap and conceal. Beneath it, some insisted, Catherine hid more than her beauty, she carried a second face, pale, thin-lipped, and hollow-eyed, a visage that belonged to no living woman. A handful of servants claimed that once, in a shaft of moonlight, they glimpsed her lifting the veil, and for an instant her features split in two, one looking ahead and the other gazing sideways into nothing, both smiling with the same eerie calm. On such nights, animals grew restless. Dogs whined and clawed at their chains, horses shuddered in their stalls, and the owls that usually kept to the treetops fell silent. One boy tasked with fetching water late saw Lady Catherine standing by the well, veil drawn low, her head tilted toward the dark opening, as though listening to a voice rising from the depths. He told no one for months, but when he finally confessed, his description chilled the household. He had heard her whisper, and though he could not understand the words, the sound was not singular. It was doubled, as though her throat carried two voices at once. By morning she was always back in her chambers, face serene, hands folded neatly as though nothing had passed. But the servants knew, and so did the field hands who caught glimpses from afar. They called her the White Shadow, and avoided crossing her path, for to meet her eyes, they said, was to feel one's soul weighed by something colder than death. The summer of 1822 was remembered not for its harvest nor for its storms, but for the night the sky over the valley burned red. St. Matthew's Church, a simple wooden structure that had stood for nearly half a century, was swallowed by fire without warning. Its bell, once used to call the faithful to prayer, tolled only once before crashing down in a rain of sparks. The flames licked high into the night, their glow visible for miles, and the smoke carried with it the acrid scent of pitch and charred hymns. Families rushed from their homes, gathering along the dirt roads to watch in horror as the sanctuary collapsed into embers. There had been no lightning, no candle left burning, and yet the blaze moved with a hunger too fierce to be natural. The Sinclairs had long avoided that church. Reverend Alcott had once tried to bring them into the congregation before his own mysterious disappearance, and the empty pew reserved for the family had grown into a symbol of their absence, a quiet accusation. Neighbors often muttered that if ever they needed redemption, it would have to come at St. Matthew's altar. Now that altar was reduced to ash, and with it the last hope that the Sinclairs might be bound to the same God as the rest of Virginia. But what chilled those who witnessed the night most deeply was not merely the destruction of the church. Across the fields, illuminated by the infernal glow, stood Lady Catherine Sinclair. She wore her white gown, and though the veil did not cover her face, the silver fabric shimmered in her hand like a banner. Some swore she was smiling, her pale features lit not with fear but with satisfaction, as though the rising flames were not calamity but fulfillment. A farmhand claimed she raised her hand once, palm outward toward the burning church, and the fire roared higher in answer, a beast fed by an unseen command. By dawn, the building was nothing but blackened beams, the charred cross leaning at an angle in the smoldering ruins. When the townsfolk gathered, none spoke aloud what they had seen, but every whispered glance turned toward Sinclairland. Rumors spread swiftly that the church had been cursed for daring to rebuke Elias and Catherine, that Lady Catherine herself had walked the fields hours before with her veil trailing in the grass, murmuring words not fit for Christian ears. The parishioners tried to rebuild, but no new structure would rise on the scorched ground. Every attempt faltered, wood rotted, stone cracked, workers fell ill. In time, the earth was left bare, a black scar across the countryside, avoided even by children. Yet the Sinclairs thrived more than ever, their crops lush, their wealth multiplying, and their household untroubled by the loss of a sanctuary they had never entered. For the valley, St. Matthew's was gone forever, and with it, perhaps, the last fragile shield against whatever covenant the Sinclairs kept in secret. The Sinclair fortune did not glimmer like ordinary wealth. By 1823, their coffers brimmed with gold coins so radiant they seemed newly minted each day, never dulled by air or the touch of human hands. Servants tasked with carrying sacks of the treasure whispered that it felt wrong in the palm, too heavy for its size, as though some invisible weight pressed from within. When placed beside the coinage of Richmond or Williamsburg, the Sinclair gold gleamed brighter, its edges sharper, its luster refusing to fade even in the dampest cellar. Elias boasted of it as providence, a reward for diligence and vision. Yet those who saw the coins up close knew better. No metal of man's minting could resist time in such a manner. Merchants at first welcomed the currency, but unease grew quickly. A silversmith in Petersburg who once tested a Sinclair coin under flame swore it gave off not the acrid smell of scorched metal but a faint sweetness, like burnt honey mixed with blood. He returned the coin at once and refused to handle another. Bankers in Richmond, upon receiving payment from Elias for imported silks, passed the coins back nervously, muttering that they sang faintly when stacked together in the counting room. The sound was not loud, nor constant, but a low metallic hum, as though some distant choir resonated within the gold itself. More than one clerk refused to remain in the room alone with the Sinclair payments. By the summer harvest, word had spread too widely. Taverns whispered that the family dealt not in the king's gold or the republic's coin, but in some older currency, minted in fires deeper than any forge. A payment belonging to their covenant rather than to the crown or state. Farmers refused to trade for it, preferring paper notes or barter, and travelers who unknowingly accepted Sinclair gold found innkeepers reluctant to give them lodging. Even thieves avoided the coffers. One highwayman, emboldened by tales of the family's wealth, was said to have stolen a pouch of the coins on the road to Charlottesville. By morning, he was found in a ditch, eyes wide open, lips cracked and blackened, as if he had swallowed soot. The pouch lay untouched beside him, the gold within shining as though polished that very hour. Yet inside Sinclair Manor, the coins were cherished. Catherine often arranged them in silver bowls throughout the drawing rooms, letting lamplight strike them until they seemed to pulse. Elias used them to pay for architects and artists from Europe, many of whom later left Virginia abruptly, muttering about dreams filled with unending choirs and shadows pressing against their walls. Still, the Sinclairs prospered, their wealth immune to doubt, their coffers filled with gold that no tarnish, no time, and no conscience could dim. The autumn of 1824 carried with it a chill that seemed sharper upon the Sinclair estate than in the surrounding fields. Servants whispered of omens in the sky, of flocks of crows that circled the manor roof at dusk and would not settle in the trees. It was during this season that Thomas Sinclair, the eldest son and heir, was discovered inside the family chapel. The boy had been missing for hours, and when a maid finally dared open the chapel doors, she found him kneeling before the crude stone altar, his small hands and forearms etched with shallow cuts that bled steadily onto the floor. The air smelled of iron and smoke, though no fire had been lit, and a hush lingered inside the room, as if voices had only just fallen silent. When Elias was summoned, he did not rage or demand who had harmed his child. Instead, he knelt beside the boy, placed a steady hand upon his shoulder, and declared in a voice that carried through the chapel, "It is an offering. It is the price of protection." His words silenced the horrified servants who had gathered in the doorway, though none would soon forget the look in Lady Catherine's eyes, a mixture of fear, pride, and something darker, as though she had expected this moment all along. Thomas was carried to his bedchamber, his wounds bound with clean linen. He did not weep or flinch but stared into the ceiling as if following unseen shapes that moved above him. For days he refused food and water, though his body did not weaken as it should have. On the third night, when Catherine drew back the curtains, she gasped. The boy's eyes, once a pale gray, had darkened entirely to black, gleaming in the candlelight like polished obsidian. He spoke little, only muttering in a low cadence that no one could recognize as any known tongue. Elias forbade the servants from seeking a physician, insisting that the boy was under the watch of older hands than any mortal healer. For weeks the house lived in unease, listening to Thomas speak softly to the air as though in conversation. His siblings avoided him, and even Catherine kept her distance, though she laid the silver veil across his chest each night before he slept, as if shielding him from something that pressed too near. Then, as suddenly as it began, the transformation ceased. By the 42nd day, his eyes returned to their familiar shade. His speech resumed in plain English, and he ate heartily as though nothing had ever passed. Yet those weeks left a mark on the household. Servants whispered that the boy had not been merely sick but changed, that the first blood debt of the new generation had been paid, binding Thomas to the same covenant that had shielded his grandfather. Elias spoke no more of it, but he kept the boy closer afterward, often walking with him through the fields at twilight, pausing at the ancient oak where the family's story had first bent toward shadow. Those who saw them together claimed Elias looked not at a son, but at an heir who had proven himself worthy of bearing the covenant forward. The year 1824 was meant to bring a union of wealth and prestige to the Sinclair line. Eliza Sinclair, the only daughter of Elias and Catherine, had been promised to Nathaniel Crowther, the heir of a prosperous planter family whose lands bordered the Sinclair estate. The match was spoken of across the county as inevitable, binding two fortunes into one. Preparations filled the manor for weeks, with servants polishing every mirror, scrubbing every stone, and filling storerooms with imported delicacies. Lady Catherine oversaw the sewing of Eliza's gown herself, a work of ivory silk stitched with silver thread. Guests whispered that the veil laid aside for her was not the ordinary kind, but Catherine's own, the one said to have been woven by cloistered nuns in France and rumored to conceal more than mere features. On the final evening before the ceremony, laughter and music spilled faintly from the hall as the family dined together. Eliza smiled, though her eyes seemed far away, often darting toward the window where the woods stretched black under the moon. When her maid entered her chamber the next morning, the bed was untouched. The gown and veil, carefully laid across the chair the night before, were gone. Alarm spread swiftly, though Elias's reaction was peculiar. He showed no signs of panic, no rush to organize search parties, only a grim and knowing expression. Still, the estate was scoured from attic to cellar, the fields combed, the woods disturbed. It was in the shadow of the ruined chapel, that place already bound to rumor, where the garments were found. The gown was spread across the steps as though carefully arranged, the veil draped over the doorway like a pall. No footprints marked the earth, no torn fabric or trace of struggle. The body of Eliza was nowhere to be seen. The Crowther family demanded answers, but Elias met them with a voice heavy with authority. "She has been claimed," he told them. "It is part of the covenant. There will be no wedding." His words chilled those who heard them, and though Nathaniel raged, he dared not press further, for the Sinclairs' power by then was vast, and their name carried the weight of dread. Whispers among the servants painted a darker picture. Some swore they had seen Eliza days earlier walking the estate in Catherine's silver veil, murmuring softly as if in conversation with someone unseen. Others claimed she had been led into the chapel by figures no one else dared follow, her face serene, her steps without hesitation. A few believed she had been sacrificed, her spirit bound to whatever pact kept the Sinclair fortune fat while the land around them struggled. Lady Catherine locked herself away for weeks after her daughter's disappearance, emerging only with her veil in hand, as if guarding a grief too strange to share. Elias never again spoke his daughter's name, nor did he acknowledge her betrothal. The estate moved forward in silence, but the fields seemed to darken, and the wind in the hollows carried a note of mourning that clung to the family like shadow. Neighbors whispered of a bride who vanished not into marriage, but into the covenant that fed the Sinclairs' unearthly prosperity. The story of Samuel Sinclair's valet spread like a sickness, whispered first among servants and field hands, then carried into the town by merchants and tavern keepers. The valet, a quiet man of foreign birth, known only as Corbin, had long been in Samuel's shadow. For years he dressed him, rode at his side, and endured the young master's tempers in silence. But in the autumn of 1826, Corbin's mind began to crack. His eyes grew wild, his speech disjointed, and at night he was heard muttering in tongues, not his own. Servants whispered that he had seen something no mortal man was meant to see, and whatever it was had lodged itself deep in his soul like a thorn. One evening, without warning, Corbin bolted from the manor. He stumbled into town half-clothed, mud clinging to his boots, his hands shaking as though palsied. At the tavern he shouted his confession, a story so terrible that even drunkards sobered at the telling. He claimed the Sinclairs were no longer men and women as others were, but something corrupted by their covenant. He said he had seen them gather at the great oak that stood beyond the ruined chapel, a tree older than the manor itself, with roots as thick as a man's body. There, beneath its branches, Elias and his heirs had spilled their own blood into the earth. Corbin swore he had watched them kneel, cutting their flesh with silver knives and feeding the crimson stream into a hollow at the tree's base. "It drinks it," he cried, "and it stirs when it is fed. Something beneath the oak, older than sin, bound to them by the blood of their children." Townsfolk listened in stunned horror. Some crossed themselves, others spat to ward off evil. The tale might have been dismissed as madness, but Corbin's eyes carried the weight of a man who had seen truth and could not bear it. His voice broke as he begged them to believe him, to take torches and burn the roots before it was too late. Yet none dared move against the Sinclairs, for fear of their wrath. The next morning, Corbin was found hanging from a branch not far from the road that led back to the estate. The rope was rough, the knot crude, as though tied in haste. Some claimed it was his own hand that ended his life, driven to despair by visions no man could endure. Others whispered darker things, that the Sinclairs themselves had seen fit to silence him, or worse, that whatever slept beneath the oak had claimed the one who spoke its name aloud. The body was cut down, buried without ceremony, and quickly forgotten by the town's elders who urged silence for the sake of peace. But among the servants, the whispers endured. When the wind moaned through the fields at night, they said it carried Corbin's broken voice, warning of roots that twisted through both soil and soul, and of blood that would never cease to flow beneath the ancient oak. By 1827, the Sinclair fortune had swelled to heights beyond comprehension. Tobacco harvests poured from the fields like rivers of green gold, their leaves impossibly lush even in years when drought scorched the neighboring farms. Ships carrying Sinclair cargo left port heavy and returned with chests of foreign coin, fine fabrics, and jewels no colonial family had ever possessed. The Sinclair manor, already grand, now glittered with imported chandeliers, polished mahogany, and endless rows of mirrors that reflected their wealth in infinite repetition. Yet those who visited returned with hushed voices, claiming that no treasure could mask the decay gnawing away at the family itself. Lady Catherine, once spoken of for her sharp beauty and mysterious silver veil, was seen now only rarely, and when she appeared her body seemed little more than bone wrapped in pale silk. Her cheeks were sunken, her skin almost translucent, and her eyes hollow, as though whatever fire once dwelled within had been drawn out drop by drop. She moved through the manor like a ghost, her whispering voice carrying no weight, her veil trailing behind her like a shroud. Some said she was dying. Others said she was being eaten alive by the very covenant she had helped weave. Elias, for all his wealth, carried the look of a man pursued by shadows. Once broad of shoulder and proud of bearing, he was now stooped, his hair streaked with gray, though not yet an old man. He was known to wander alone across the estate at night, muttering into the darkness, his hands streaked with earth, and sometimes with blood. When asked, he spoke of sacrifices and bargains, his words fevered, his gaze distant. Guests at his table found him courteous but distracted, as though his mind was never fully present, as if something unseen sat beside him, whispering into his ear. Of the 3 Sinclair children once known, only 2 remained. Samuel grew strange and cruel, his pale face marred by fits of rage that left servants trembling. He was often found lurking by the chapel ruins, carving symbols into the stones with knives. Thomas, the heir, carried the same unnatural pallor, his eyes too dark and too deep for one so young. Both boys rarely laughed and never played as other children did. Neighbors whispered that Eliza, the missing daughter, had not been stolen away, as Elias claimed, but swallowed whole by the covenant itself, offered up to keep the family's wealth flowing. The townsfolk had begun to speak of a dreadful balance, a scale weighted by riches on one side and by lives on the other. With each passing year, the gold piled higher, and with each passing year, the Sinclairs diminished. It was said in whispers that the covenant demanded not just blood, but blood of their own line, that prosperity was purchased at the cost of family flesh. Thus the estate grew ever brighter with riches, and ever darker in soul. By 1827, even those who once envied the Sinclairs began to fear them. For what use is gold, they asked, if every coin carries the weight of a family devoured from within? By 1830, the once proud Sinclair estate stood silent, its windows black and empty, the great doors barred not by lock but by the weight of abandonment. The fields that had once gleamed with endless tobacco lay fallow, their soil cracked and barren as though drained of something vital. The manor's white columns, once polished and gleaming, now bore streaks of weathered gray, while ivy crept over the stone like grasping fingers intent on claiming the house back for the earth. Servants were gone, wagons no longer passed the gates, and the laughter or cries of the Sinclair children had long since faded. It was said the covenant had finally consumed the last of them, leaving only hollow halls echoing with the residue of whispered bargains. Yet one thing remained, steadfast as it had been since the family's rise, the ancient oak at the heart of the estate. Its gnarled branches stretched wide as though in triumph, roots burrowing deep into ground heavy with secrets. Locals dared not approach after nightfall, for it was under those branches that many had vanished, and under those roots that the covenant was believed to sleep. Some claimed to hear faint cries from beneath the soil, as though the earth itself mourned what had been buried there. It became the subject of whispered legend in the villages. Children were warned never to wander too close, and travelers were told to quicken their pace when the oak loomed in view. The boldest among them, driven by greed or desperation, brought shovels to its roots, lured by tales of gold that never dulled. Indeed, coins were sometimes found perfect discs, gleaming as though freshly minted, singing faintly in the dark just as bankers once whispered they did. But none who carried such coins lived to see another harvest. They were claimed before the year's end, vanishing into woods, into water, into silence. Their names joined the Sinclairs in hushed remembrance, spoken only in fear. The manor itself decayed, yet no one dared claim its stone or timber. Doors rotted, floors sagged, but the air within remained heavy, pressing on the chest of any who entered. Farmers swore they had seen pale faces at the windows, though the house was long empty. At times, a silver glint like Lady Catherine's veil was said to drift between the shadows of the rooms, or the faint sound of a child's laughter echoed across the halls, where no children played. Thus the Sinclairs endured not in life, nor in riches, but in the stories of their fall. The journals that survived ended abruptly, leaving only fragments and rumor to bind together the truth. Yet all agreed on one point. Theirs was a dynasty bought not with sweat or toil, but with blood more precious than gold. And as long as the oak still rooted itself in that cursed earth, the covenant, unfinished and eternal, lingered. The Sinclair name did not fade with the crumbling of walls, nor with the silence of the estate. It persisted in whispers, in warnings, in the dread that passed from one generation to the next, a legacy unfinished, waiting for the next soul bolder foolish enough to claim it.